first thing, installing DataGraph. Hopefully everyone has DataGraph on their computer now. You can get DataGraph either from our website or you can get it from the Mac App Store. If you don't have a license, it does automatically give a 7-day trial if you get it from us. So there is a more detailed installation guide. I'm not going to go through that. We'll go ahead and move on to creating a new file. And if you have DataGraph open, one of the first things that you should see is the online example window. You can create a new file by clicking the blank file button that's in the bottom right-hand corner, or you can go File New. This is a list of all other files that you can click to open and browse, all these different things that are created in DataGraph. When you click open here, it does create a new instance of the file. So it's a copy that you can then do whatever you want with. You won't in any way change the actual example file itself. It'll make a copy that you can work with. But for this, go ahead and make a blank file. Okay, and I'll go ahead and zoom this out here. So here we go. We've got our new file. Next step. That was easy. Importing our data. Oh, I guess I should point out, let me just make sure I do point out this. If you're brand new or you're opening DataGraph on a new computer, we have these help bubbles that show up. You can uncheck this button as pointed out in the documentation so that when you make a new file, you won't see those bubbles. They are meant to be helpful, but I'm sure at some point you won't want to see them anymore and you can remove them for new files. Also, as you add elements to a file, those things will disappear. Okay, so importing data. There are, in fact, a lot of different ways that you can import data within DataGraph, and from creating your own custom data parsers, you can import batches of files all at once. We're going to stick with this simple example. And in fact, the file that I'm going to use here, there's a link where you can download it yourself. It's called airmiles.csv. One way to get this, sometimes I know, depending on the browser, if you click on it, we'll just show you the data. If you want to actually download the file, you can right-click or control-click, or what I do is 2 fingers on my touchpad to get the right-click, and then you would say, download linked file. I have already done that. So if I go over to my DataGraph file here, I can say data import file, as is shown in the example on the web. And sure enough, among other things, oh, Zoom was trying to install a new version on me. That's very sneaky. There you see airmiles.csv, and I can go ahead and say open. What happens when you do that is DataGraph will bring in the data, and it also is doing what's called parsing the data. It's trying to understand the data type associated with each column that it finds. For CSV files, which are comma separated values, that is typically relatively straightforward, and it was easily able to figure out that these 2 columns are number columns, and it assigned a title to each of these. So this is something that, again, sort of highlights kind of the difference between DataGraph and a spreadsheet. Here, it's more like a database type of an approach, or a programming approach, where we have named columns of data that you can change. You can double click on these names within the data table or over here on the data panel to change these names. And if we go back and actually just look a little bit at the documentation, it talks about here, one thing I didn't mention, there's a built-in row counter. It has an object associated with it in this panel. And there's our row counter right there. Again, it brought the data in, but you will notice on every object that a column has, every column that's in your table is going to have an associated object. It's almost like a self-documenting approach, where you'll see a list of all your columns, and the icon that I have highlighted here shows you a symbol that represents the data type assigned to that column. If you find data was imported and it's not the right data type, that's something actually you can change. Data types are really the interpretation of the information. Changing the data type doesn't change the data in any way. This is actually different than spreadsheets have kind of this infamous thing that they do. If you bring in something that looks like a date, it will change the underlying information to represent a date, and it actually changes the data, the underlying data. DataGraph doesn't do that. It's just interpreting information. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just so you're aware, you can change these data types pretty easily, and it outlines that here. Also, note that in this guide, there are links to help documents for these different types of data. So if you want to learn a little bit more about a number column or a text column, or how do you specify dates, what the options are associated with each of these, you can go in there and learn more about that. Next, the next thing that we have is adding drawing commands. Let me just maybe touch in with everyone. Did anyone, if there's anyone following along with the, I don't know if I can see a list of everyone right here, but if anyone in the chat, I guess, had trouble, if you're trying to import and you're having any issues, then maybe let me know. I oddly can't see the participant list right now, but I do see the chat. So that's the best way to communicate with me during this. Okay, one thing before we add the drawing commands, I did want to point out that the data side panel itself, this whole thing here is all something that you can hide when you don't need it anymore. And you can do that by clicking this icon in the toolbar. There's a data toolbar that you can click to hide it. You can also click this X here that's in the top left-hand corner of it. What I actually do more than anything is I do a Command D shortcut, D for data, command, the command key, and D, and it opens and closes that. That's a really handy shortcut for being able to change that. My screen is kind of wide right now. Hopefully you can see it okay through Zoom, but typically I would do a lot on my laptop, and that Command D is a very handy shortcut. Okay, so next, adding a drawing command. You'll see in the documentation that it shows you what happens when you click on this draw icon within the toolbar. Go ahead and click that, and you will see a list of all these commands that are available for creating graphs of different types. You can think of each of these commands more, they're not individual templates, they're more like a module that has all sorts of different options available for drawing things in different ways. And if you click add here, it adds an object to the UI. It's going to add it over here, and it will have all the options laid out for you. DataGraph really is, in a sense, a visual programming language. And by clicking these, you're telling the program to add a plot module to this particular graph. So I'm going to go ahead and click add here. And sure enough, it added this object that is the plot command. You'll notice that there are several commands, including the plot, that have direct shortcuts within the toolbar itself. There's also ways to customize. If there's a command that you use frequently, you can put it right up here. That's in our help documentation. You can find out how to customize that. I'm not going to go into that now. But let's see, we went back over here. You can see we added the drawing command object. And as in my example that I'm showing you, as well as described here, the graph is blank since we haven't specified the input data yet. If you see the X and Y on the plot says nothing, again, that just means no data has been specified. Here's a table that has links to all these other command help documents that you can get to. You also can get to those help documents within DataGraph by clicking draw, and the question marks that are here beside each one will jump you online to that particular help document for that command. And there's a lot of examples there of different things that you can create. Okay, let me keep going and go to the next part. Part 5 is specifying the input data. This is a matter of taking those menus where it says X and Y, and by default said nothing when we added it, and using them to select the columns that you want to draw. If I go back into DataGraph, I can use this menu. I can say, set that to time. Now I'm going to set my Y to air miles. Once I have both of them, now I have a graph. I can use these. Oops. I can try to get my mouse to do this for me. There we go. I have this mouse set to be really big so you can see it. And it's not always exactly where I think it is. But anyway, you can see how you can change the size here. And now that we've specified the input data, you can see that. Now there's other ways to do this. And there's actually a handy shortcut that will let you both add the command and specify the data at the same time. To do that, you can go ahead up here into where we'll have thumbnails of all the graphs we create, click the plus symbol. And then if you hold the shift key and click the header of a column, and then click another one, it will let you select multiple columns. This is similar to in a spreadsheet where you collect a cell range. You have to highlight ranges of cells, but here we don't deal with cell ranges. We deal with columns. So we can select both of these columns together. Then if I click the plot command, the icon to add the plot, it will automatically populate the data and show me the graph. There are several commands that have this ability to automatically populate data or populate the input that's specified. The plot command is one of them. Points does the same, fit can do the same, bar can do the same. So these 4 commands right here, I could add all of them to this graph. And in fact, I think it's kind of a fun thing to do. So if you want to, this isn't exactly outlined in the quick start guide, but if you want to try this out, highlight these columns again, add the points, highlight these columns again, add a fit. It's going to, by default, do a linear fit, add these columns again, and add a bar command. So now all these different things are here. They changed the range. When I added the fit, it added a linear fit, and it changed the range of the data to show the whole fit. And a really important thing to recognize is that every time you add a command, these are independent drawing layers that are added onto your active graph as you work on it here. And the layers themselves are drawn on the graph in the order they are seen in this list. So if I want the bars to be behind everything else, I can click this icon, drag it up to the top. Now, let me make I'm going to be in, so I'm in the style settings, making the point size much bigger. Now the bars are drawn behind everything else. So just to illustrate, if I click this object and drag it to the bottom, now that is drawn in front of everything else. So you have a lot of control over how these things are drawn. The other thing in common with the drawing commands that is very useful are that every one, let me put a box around this here, every one of these has a hide and an exclude button. And what this button does is allows you to, if you decide, you know what, I don't really want to have a fit here, I can just click hide and it's not going to show it on my graph, but I haven't had to delete the object itself. Notice when I do the hide, the range doesn't change, but if I click exclude, it's as though I've deleted this command without actually having to delete it. So this is really handy when you're building a graph and you're not exactly sure what things you want to include or exclude, or maybe you want to show some data and hide others. These 2 buttons are really useful. Now, I actually am not fitting this at all, so I'll go ahead and just select that and hit the delete key. Now that command is just gone from this graph. I can also delete my bars if I want, and I can delete the points if I want and go back to the way that you'll see this on the web page. Okay. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is go into customizing the commands themselves. And the nice thing about this compared to doing something in a programming language, you have to remember all the syntax for how do I change the color? How do I change the line style? How do I add a point? Here, all those options are laid out for you. And what you'll see is as we do things like on this object, the line style and the point style are 2 things we can change. I can add a point directly to the line, either, actually point this out to you, either an open point like this will have its own additional fill color that you can change, or a solid point. And you can also change the color here to be something within this color menu. The color menu you see here actually is something you can also customize, have your own colors, or go to the color picker. I'll go ahead and click that and just change this to red. The plot command in particular, the way that it is set up is that the color of the point and the color of the line always match. That's just the default in this command. If you do an open point, then the outline of the point and the color itself match. We'll just go ahead and stick with the solid point. That's what I have in the example. But what I want you to notice is this. This is an icon here that is a custom icon that is changing every time I'm changing some of these options. I only have this one command here, so it's pretty easy to see what this does. But as I think you could see when I had multiple commands, having these icons, particularly having them be customized to correspond to the things like color in my whatever I'm drawing, makes it really easy to navigate through multiple of these commands when I have a lot of them. So that's very helpful. Okay, I'm going to go back here. So we've done some customization, and there's a quick video demo here that you can go ahead and play, which basically walks through the steps that we've done to this point. I think this also uses the sliders to change the sizes of the line thickness and the point style. The commands all have more options that you can get to by clicking the top left corner and expanding them out. For example, the plot command has an option of line type. By default, it's just connecting the lines, but I can change this from being a straight line to a smooth line to being steps that are in various ways. I'll let you explore that, or go to the plot documentation, and the documentation for the command will go through each of these options and give you examples for them. Okay, next part of this, annotating your graph. This is one of the things that I think is particularly really nice about DataGraph, is that not only can you create the graphs, but you can do your final formatting and annotation all in the same place. If you're a researcher and you or anyone who deals with data, you know, often data gets updated and changed. So this way, even your annotations and your labels, you don't need to redo them if you change your data. Just plop in new data and everything will update. How do I do annotations? I do them in a very similar way as I do my graphing. I add a command that has different ways of annotating my graph. So in this example, this is using a label command. Let's go ahead and go back into DataGraph, and I will do this here. So right next to the icon for draw, there's an icon called label. If you go ahead and click that, then it shows you a menu of these various commands for annotating. The one that I'm going to use here is just called label, and it's going to, as it's described here, it will attach a label to a single point on the graph. And I can just click here to add it. Again, this is another one that does have an icon up in the toolbar. But when I clicked that, it added both this object and it also added this element to the graph itself. Now, the graph window where you have your active graph, this we often refer to it as a drawing canvas, because this is where you can add all these different elements and be creative with what you're doing. This element is something that you can interact with on the active window itself. And there's actually a lot of things that you can customize within this graph window without even going up to the objects where we have our settings and our commands. So first of all, you've added a label command, click on the text and just move it around, right? I can move it in a circle, and the point is always going to be at the same location. If I want to move the whole thing, click on the center of the object or the arrow. I can move this around, and if I get it close to a point, it's going to snap to that point. Once it's in place and you're pointing where you want to be, it will also snap. If I move this to be vertical, it'll snap to a straight line, since that's a common thing for people to want to do. And if I want to change the text, I have two ways I can do it. I can go to the command and I can say, here it is, my label, or I can double click the text itself. There we go. And I get a pop-up that's going to show me to zoom in on this a little bit, show me whatever I've typed in there, and I can edit it here as well. And in the example online, what the 10 steps talks about is the fact that you can add actually a token to this text field. And I want you to notice that within these settings, there's a number of different text boxes that you can add elements. You can add a title. Here's a text box for a title. To the right of that is a little symbol. Here's an XY title that you can type things into. They both have a symbol, plus symbol next to it, and the same thing with this label here. Anywhere where you see a text box, you'll see this little plus symbol next to it. And when you click that, you'll see a menu that pops up, and it will give you a list of things available in that particular place. So it won't always be the same exact things available, but here for this command, for this label, I can put a token that will show me whatever X value my arrow is pointing to. Click that, hit enter, and sure enough, now my label, let me make my font bigger so you can hopefully see this, label has the year it's pointing to. Now I no longer want to show the text, so let me just, delete everything, did not do that. Let's go ahead and delete the text, enter. And now if I move this arrow, look how the year updates. So it's just kind of a cool thing to do. And this is sort of the approach we like to use. Again, if you move this or change this, you don't need to retype this in. It will update for you and show you the X value it's pointing at. Okay. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. So anywhere you see one of these blue tokens, blue pill-shaped objects, it's a token that could be various things. And there should be a label there that gives you a clue as to what this is. So this says, for example, X value to let you know it is showing you the X value. Okay, so we did a little bit of annotation. And similar to with these other sections, there are links to these various types of annotation tools, those commands that do that. Now, if we want to go to formatting our graph, there are so many things that you can do with formatting. But I tell people all the time, where to start is with the graph size. And that's what this talks about. Now, first of all, these 3 objects that you see above every graph, these are where all your settings are, all kind of captured in these 3 objects. The first one is the style settings, the canvas settings, and the axis settings. They each have documents that go through all different documentation of what's in there. But what I really like to tell people is where to start is sizing the graph, because how you size other things is going to depend on the size of the graph itself. And again, this is really kind of designed for making publication quality graphs. So this shows you the graph size, talks about them. I'm not going to go into complete detail on everything that's here. You can go back and read through this a little bit more, but let's do that first in this graph. So again, handy tip, hover your mouse over any of these objects and wait a moment, and there'll be a tooltip that pops up and lets you know what it is. My mouse is so big right now, it's kind of covering them up. But here, again, the style settings, I'm going to, actually, I'm on the canvas settings. Here's where the size is. I'm going to change this from automatic to specified. By default, it's going to set to 5 inches by 3 inches. And often, what is the case is that the sizing you did that looked good maybe on the screen is way too big for what you would put in a document. For example, I just used the slider to up this to 25-point font. That's a really big font. So I might want this to really be more like a 10-point font. I can use the slider or just type that in. That looks a lot better. The size of my points, same thing, way too big. 5 might be appropriate. And you get used to, what sizing works for your particular, if there's a particular size that you need for a journal or graphs that you're working on. But if you at least get close here, then you'll hopefully pick fonts and line sizes that look appropriate. To the right of the size is where you can change the zoom, because now that this is sized to pixels 4 or 5 inches by 3 inches, it looks a little small on my screen. So I can change this to make this much bigger. There's also a handy option for saying actual, and that will on your computer screen show you 5 inches by 3 inches. And notice it's the whole thing that it's showing, the height and the width, the whole area that's shown here, that's white for this graph, is what is 5 inches by 3 inches when I put it in a document. And that's what publishers usually specify. When they're telling you how big a graph should be, they're not talking about the center window, they're talking about the whole thing. Okay, so we did the size of the graph. The other things that are formatted in that section are adding titles. I'm just going to add something quick here. And, you know, I can put my X and my Y, I can add titles there. And also within the style settings, there's a number of different options that the Quick Start Guide goes through where you change the look of the graph. And that's essentially the settings that are in this particular section of the user interface are all about kind of the overall feel of the graph. For example, the box style has a default that goes all the way around the graph, but I could change the box style to being just the axes if I don't want to draw all those lines. I can add a grid, maybe just in one direction, for example, just the Y direction. I could change that to a solid line. I can change that color of the line, use the color picker to change it to maybe a gray. This is all outlined in the online document. Another couple of things that I think are handy things to realize: if you don't want minor tick marks, or if you don't want any tick marks when you have a grid line, I like these two options so you can uncheck minor and check the grid. Okay, so now this graph is looking more like the one that you would see in the example, except for one thing. I also, in the example, it talks about relative sizing of the font, because every font, anything that's a font that's in the graph has to have a size associated with it. And what we do in DataGraph is we have not only the main font that you've set right here, but there also are font groups where every element that you see in your graph is assigned to one of these groups. If, for example, I wanted all my labels to be to override the main font in some way, I could actually use this menu to specify a completely different font. But what I think is really handy, because there's we always think about a workflow, how do you work on something and try and make it quick, that you can overwrite just certain elements of the main font. So maybe you want all your labels to be red, then that will change your label to red. Maybe you don't want that and you want to keep it the same color as everything else. Or maybe you want your labels to be a little bit bigger of a size. And that's what this menu does. You can either bump up or bump down sizes. So I could make my labels a little bit bigger. I often like to make my axis fonts a little bit smaller. So anyway, that's something that you can play with. And lastly, I guess the title itself, if you want to bump that up to make it bigger, you can open the Canvas settings, and there's the same type of setup here where I can bump that size up to make the title a little bit bigger. And then that gives me just a much more balanced looking graph. Okay, we've gotten through all of that. You can look through this in a little bit more detail. All these options I did are outlined here. Adding the titles, changing the fonts, it's all outlined here. The last thing I'll do, and then I'm going to look at the chat and see what other questions you have, is just exporting your graph. Oh, and a comment about saving. So to export, this is really easy. I can just, the quickest way that I do all the time is just to right click on the active graph. You can say copy and copy figure and then paste it in somewhere else. You can export graphs into files, but you don't have to. So here, for example, I'm just going to right click on the graph. I'll say copy, copy figure, and I have a document here all ready to go. I can paste this in. And again, if I print this out, the size of this graph from the entire outline would be 5 inches by 3 inches. And so if I wanted my font here to match, if my document, for example, was going to be Times and I wanted a 10-point font in my graph, I can change that here to this. And then when I copy this figure, oops, and then again, delete the one I put here, paste this in, now I know my font sizing is appropriate for the document that I created. Okay. Let me get to the chat, and that I did want to comment on saving a little bit because there's one thing that's important. But I see a question, a very good question. What is the limit of the number of records that you can have in a cell, cells, lines, or rows that one can import? So DataGraph is really designed to work with very large data sets very efficiently. And our limit on the number of rows, so if you have a column you bring in that has a lot of rows, I think we're up to maybe the limit. It's really based on not our limit, the limit of the machine. I think 50 million rows. I mean, it's very, very high. So unless you're working with really, really big data sets, you should be fine. The program might get around, if you have around 10 million rows, things might get a little sluggish. There are some things that have problems with big data like that. Like, for example, if you're plotting really, really noisy data and you're plotting it as a line plot, that can be very slow to render. And there's some things that we do to try and make that better. So that's one thing to be aware of. Also, points, if you're trying to plot 1 million points, you just won't even see them. There's not enough pixels on your screen for that to make sense. So what we do is we actually change from drawing an object as a point to drawing a pixel. And in the preferences of the program, there is a setting for when do you want to switch from drawing the point to drawing it as a pixel, because again, drawing 1 million points, that would, as these objects like this, takes a lot to render. So I guess the other thing to keep in mind is that DataGraph works best when you have long data as opposed to wide data. If you have hundreds and hundreds of columns, we often recommend that you flatten that data. And there is, in fact, it's not, that wouldn't make sense for the data that I have here, but there is an option for flattening columns, data flattened columns. That is really useful. In fact, if we go into the help documentation, this should be something that I can find relatively easy. How to flatten data. So this will show you a data set that is a wide data set and taking that and making it a long data set. And that generally is a much faster and easier to work with that type of data. It's great for data pivoting and all sorts of other things. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Let's see. So hopefully that answered that question, maybe more than you needed. Do you know how DataGraph handles different date systems? 1900 versus 1904, Mac versus PC, or I assume it's up to the importer to format the file to be imported. There was something just recently that came up with dates related to just that. And I'm trying to remember now what it was, but generally DataGraph should be fine with dates. There have in the past been issues with just what you're talking about, that whether a file from Excel is coming from maybe the Mac or Windows. Not exactly sure if I'm remembering this properly, but DataGraph is very flexible in terms of how it can import dates. The one thing I will say, if you're importing from Excel, it is generally better. You can copy and paste data into DataGraph, but you're much better off doing an import from Excel. So there is there's an import Excel file portion. This is a way for you to select an Excel file and select a range of cells that you want to just import. You can actually take any Excel file and just right click it and say open with DataGraph, and it'll import everything in the Excel file. It actually does a nice job of mapping Excel tabs to DataGraph groups. I haven't shown you a group yet if you haven't seen that before, but this little object right here is a DataGraph, is a way to add a group. And if I click that, it adds this other element into my graph, and I can click and drag these columns around, and now I've placed this in a group. So when you import Excel that has multiple tabs, it will, if you just open an Excel file using DataGraph, it will put the tabs in groups. Anyway, if you open Excel that way, rather than copying and pasting, then the dates should come in properly. If you don't see them coming in properly, we would certainly want to know about it. But the other thing that often people have are strange date formats. If you're getting data from an instrument that has a very specific date format that it has, DataGraph has custom formatting options. So right here, I clicked this, I clicked this button right here. This added a date column to my screen. And when it does that, it asks you what is the format. So by default, it's asking for month, day, year. It has all these built-in formats, but you can also say that you want to do an ICU format, and then you can type in a format string. I have yet to find a date format that I could not get to work with the date string here properly without doing any modification of dates. So anyway, maybe I went into that more than I needed to, but I think it does a good job with dates. Any best practices on color palettes, spacing, or formatting? So best practices on color palette, spacing, or formatting. Well, I will say that, what DataGraph does, the way the program is set up, is to try and do a good job by default. So what you'll notice, and I think this is not something people expect initially, because it's just different than what you've used before. If I size this graph, and I'm going to now, notice the tick marks on the y-axis. If I make this graph smaller, at some point, those tick marks in between are going to disappear. And it's going to change also where the, how many tick marks, how many major tick marks versus minor tick marks to get the sizing proper. So, and this is, again, one of the reasons why, if you look at this and you said, oh, I don't want those tick marks, well, this is also set to automatic sizing. Make sure you set the size to what you really want it to be. Then you can see what the tick marks look like to see how you might want to change it. In terms of color, there's just a lot of options within DataGraph that are more than what we can go into here. But one thing is, if you go into the color, the style settings and expand them, you'll see these tiles. These are what you see in that color menu when you pick a color. There are a number of presets that you can click to change these to, and I don't have anything in here that's really that interesting that's using color, but that will create a new color scheme. But we also have color schemes that are data driven that, well, probably the easiest way to show that is through, there's this one on heat maps. Those are built-in color schemes. Maybe if I just search on color schemes here, look at this one. Yeah, this is a good one to show, actually, because this is showing you a bunch of different graphs, and the colors on this are actually all data driven, and they are based on what you see here. This is a color scheme variable. And if I change this navy blue color, that's A, to hot pink, it just changed in every single graph. So now A has a hot pink color associated with it. And what we do in DataGraph is we have color schemes that are from a color, well, it's called Color Brewer. This is in our documentation. If you go to the color scheme variable, you can learn about Color Brewer. But when you click on this little gear menu on this color scheme, it has color suggestions that are of all different color types that are color schemes that are meant to work together in various ways. These color schemes are actually developed for mapping purposes. But if I change this here, again, now all my graphs are set using the same color scheme, using this data-driven approach. So it's kind of a cool thing. So I don't know. I hope that sort of answers your question. And let's see. Okay, adding text labels. Thought that was very handy. I'm glad. Thank you so much. I think the text labels can be added both with the label command, as well as there is a command called the text command. That's just for adding an individual bit of text that you can also click and drag and move around. Most of the commands under this label menu are very interactive, where they add elements that you can click and drag around. If I want to highlight a region, add the region command. That's something I can click and drag around. And if I want to delete it, I can just hit the delete key and get rid of it. Okay, let's see. How about to angle the text labels on the X and Y axis? So if you have a really long text label, let me just make this very long. Apples, we'll go over here. Actually, it's still not long enough. Remember, we'll repeat apples twice. Okay, so this is too long to fit there, and I might want to rotate these. There's two things here. First is go into your axis settings. So this is, again, hover over this. Yep, the icon here looks like an axis. Expand that open. And what you'll notice is that there is an option here for X and Y tick marks. And this is where you have some formatting options in various types of things. I won't go through all that, but just to the right of that is where you can change. Oh, I meant to do this for the Y or the X axis. You can change the rotation of the axis. Now notice when things fall off the screen, if it is going out of the bounds based on my 5 inches by 3 inches, it is, not everything will automatically expand. And there's a reason for that, because we want these distances to be very predictable. If you're doing just one graph, it might not make a big difference, but when you're doing a whole bunch of graphs, then I always want these distances to be predictable. And the distance, the amount of what we call the space for the labels is set here. So this is the space for X is currently set to a medium. And if I change this to high or extra high, then it's going to give me more room for those variables. So you can do both in tandem. And again, it might just seem a little bit, well, why doesn't it just expand to exactly the spot it wants? Perhaps we should have an automatic setting that does that. But because we want the sizing to be very predictable, if you have a graph that you create in a different file that you also say space for X is extra high and you have the same font, the size of the window is going to match exactly. So you can have a real consistency between your graphs. Let's see. If I modify the data dynamically while sliding, does it modify the source data file? Not sure I exactly understand that question, but if you do modify the data dynamically, everything should update. Oh, maybe what you're thinking about there. So this is a question about modifying the data dynamically. You can link to other files. So what we did is import data. You can link to data. And to do that, that would be in the other menu. There's a link to a URL or file. You can type in an HTTPS or HTTP address and link to a file that's on a web server. In fact, you could even do that with the Air Miles file that we did. Or you can link to a file that's on your own computer. But if you link to a file that's on your computer, so say you link to a text file that has data coming into it, I think this might be what you mean. I know we have some other people that use this. You can actually have a timed reload of the file. So right here, there's a box for time to reload that you can click, and you can, currently it's set to 15 minutes. So if you want to just update every so often, but you can make this really short. I think you can go down to like 5 seconds. We do have someone who has experiments that they have the data being piped into a CSV file that DataGraph is linked to, and it just constantly updates so they can see in real time how the data is changing. I don't know if that's exactly what you wanted, but it's kind of a cool use case. There's a question about how to save a color palette without always using the color picker. Well, I guess sort of 2 ways. There is certainly the using a data-driven color scheme. The other way would be within your style settings, if you create a palette that you like. So these colors are not data-driven, since these are just the colors in the menu, but I can change these to a color scheme that I like, and then apply that to a different graph really easily. Or have a file that I open as my own template. So I didn't go into that in a lot of detail, but you can make your own user templates that you would set up. Here's some that I had set up before. I don't know if you can hear my dog barking in the background. But that way you could have a file set up with your own color scheme and put it in this user template. There's instructions on how to do that online. If you're not sure, reach out to me and I'll let you know. But then you could have, my file with my special color scheme that you always open. Because once you change, maybe this is a helpful thing to realize. If I change my color scheme here, so I'm going to put a very bold green color in the beginning of the style settings for this graph, and I make another graph, then that new graph will also have the green. So anytime I change this style setting, any new graphs I make are going to use that style. And the style settings, you literally can copy and paste these between files. So if I like this style setting, I can highlight it, say edit, copy, go into a different file, and click a thumbnail and paste that in, and it will paste those settings over. In fact, in the rest of the that web page that we were going through, that's what it talks about at the bottom. And I walk through an example there of how you can take the settings and the commands and copy and paste them between files. I think it's a really important thing to recognize that everything you do within a graph, you can apply to another graph without having to redo it. I know some folks have to run. I'm going to continue to answer whatever questions people have and continue to stay online. I do want to say that when you're saving files, this was kind of the last thing that's on that page. Just pay attention to, we have a new file format that's on the page. That there's a help page about saving files. It's a file format that's called DGraphs, as opposed to our traditional DGraph file. I know this is a little bit of a detail, but we're going to be eventually switching to this as our default format. And if you're saving on OneDrive or Dropbox or any remote server, they have been known to have trouble with maybe it's an older file format. It's not really older in the sense that it's an Apple standard, this package file, but some of these remote systems do not work well with it. So we are transitioning to a different format. So anyway, that's something to pay attention to. If you're using OneDrive or one of those, then make sure you look at how to save properly. Actually, I can just show you right here. When you go to File, Save, you'll see 2 options. If you're going on a remote server, make sure to pick the DGraphs option. You can save a DGraph there, and many people have done it fine for years. I save on a remote server. It doesn't have a problem with my system, but with some people, it has been known to corrupt the files, for lack of better words, which is very problematic. Anyway, let me see what. Okay, so there's a question about how DataGraph differs from other eChart. Actually, I'm not familiar with that one. Python and in R in terms of graphing principles. Actually, I would say ggplot is similar to DataGraph in many ways, or maybe DataGraph is similar to ggplot, depending on how you look at it. But because in ggplot, you basically write commands that add layers to a graph, and DataGraph is very similar in that approach. If you work in R, then you use different packages in R for graphing with ggplot that will do different things and create different kinds of graphs. DataGraph, the drawing commands that we have, each one of these is like a package that can do all sorts of different graphs within this given style. I mean, the difference is certainly, one of the big differences that I can, do my scatter plot here, and I can interactively change everything just in real time as I'm working with my data. So I think that's a big benefit. And the fact that these are also interchangeable, I'll just show you here one example. If I, here's a plot command plotting this data. If I want to put this on one of these other graphs, I can just do edit copy, go to another thumbnail and say edit paste. It brought in this object, and now it's drawing that object there. So things like legends, you add a legend. To add a legend, you add a legend command. Here, I have a legend set up the way I want it. If I wanted that legend in this other graph, I don't have to recreate it. You can also just drag and drop commands between thumbnails, and it will put that object into there. Something to kind of play with. If you have any additional questions, you are welcome always to post on the forum. You can, if you don't have a forum account, go under DataGraph Help, Community Forum. If you click Create Account, it's actually going to request, and it doesn't give the account access immediately. We're linking those accounts to your license. So, or you can email me actually if you're or email actually the right here, email question, ask question via email, help@visualdatatools.com. And I hope everyone has a good weekend. And again, appreciate you guys for participating. Had lots of good questions today.